diplomacy found itself in crisis during the armed conflict with Hamas. Growing voices in the U.S., Europe, and around the world criticized Israel, including American politicians and celebrities. The Gaza conflict exposed fault lines of Israel. While more than 4,000 rockets were launched at Israel, the imbalance of power between Israel and the enclaved and closed Gaza Strip, along with the images of destruction from Gaza and the great number of dead in the Strip, made the Israeli case harder to communicate. For more on that, I'm joined by Yigal Palmor. He's the head of international relations at the Jewish Agency for Israel, and by Yves Barlow, who's a journalist and activist in Los Angeles. Thank you so much for joining us, both of you. Yigal, I want to start with you. What is Israel's strategy in trying to communicate its side of the conflict these days?
Well, the strategy, as far as I understand it, because I wasn't taking part in elaborating it, but as far as I understand, the strategy was to show that Hamas was to blame because they started by firing rockets on civilians. They started by firing on Jerusalem, and Israel was only trying to make them stop firing rockets. That was the strategy. And then it became more complicated because there was an attempt to show what Hamas really is, what their objectives are, and why they are not exactly champions of the Palestinian cause. And then it became a bit fuzzy from there. But basically, the strategy was to show that we are dealing with a terror group that fires indiscriminately on civilians, and everything needs to be done in order to stop that.
But although Hamas is widely regarded to around the world as a terror organization, can Israel win this war of public opinion as long as Gaza and the West Bank are not sovereign? Would the fight for independence overshadow any other argument that is made by Israel?
I don't know if it can win, but it can certainly do much better. It has in the past, and it could have done even better then. However, we don't use the arguments that go to the points that our critics are making. People who support Israel will happily use these arguments in defense of Israel, but people who are critical of Israeli action usually point out to the fact that Israel is not negotiating peace with the Palestinians, that there are settlements expanding on Palestinian territory. And so the question then is not really the rockets, but the broader situation. And in this respect, the government, if the government's messages are only focusing on the rockets, they're completely missing the point. And the war of image is not just focused on the rockets, even if we or the IDF would like it to be. It's on the greater issue, and on the greater issue, the government of Israel has no message. And that is the main point. Okay. That is the main problem.
Now, social media saw an explosion of posts delegitimizing the existence of the State of Israel and the right of Jews for a home in the Holy Land. A lot of misinformation and fake news was spread easily, including posts that claim that Israel doesn't even exist as a country, while Palestine is the true name of the state. And I want to turn to you, Yves, and ask what sort of misinformation and anti-Israel posts have you been confronting and trying to tackle in your work online?
Yeah, there has been an unseemly amount of false narratives about the Israel conflict with Hamas, and these have been spread by various social media, Instagram influencers and Twitter influencers, and huge celebrities. So some of these people range from mainstream media voices such as John Oliver and Trevor Noah. Trevor Noah focused on the fact that there isn't a fair fight, according to him, between the Palestinians and the Israelis. John Oliver made reference to war crimes brands. A lot of these social media influencers, such as Diet Prada and Refinery29, are using the Sheikh Jarrah example, a private residential dispute, as an example of evidence for Israeli apartheid, for ethnic cleansing, all of these very inflammatory, false, ahistorical untruths about Israel as a state. And we see people, pop stars such as Halsey, who has 14.1 million followers on Twitter. That's more followers than there are Jews alive on this earth. She tweeted, "It is not too complicated to understand that brown children are being murdered and people are being displaced under the occupation of one of the most powerful armies in the world. It is willful ignorance to conflate these simple horrors with religion and geopolitics. Hashtag Free Palestine." So what we're seeing a lot of is the conflation of the Black Lives Matter messaging of anti-Black racism in America, which is hoisted upon the idea of a war between Black and brown oppression, i.e. on the Palestinian side, versus white supremacy on the Israeli side, which we know to be completely untruthful and not rooted in any form of historical or current fact.
And Eve, you mentioned some American celebrities and TV hosts that expressed their views, and now some Israeli satirists stood up for Israel as well, especially after John Oliver tore into the Israeli policy in Gaza, accusing the Jewish state of war crimes and apartheid. Lior Schlein, an Israeli satirist who hosted Gava Uma and was working for Eretz Nehederet, made an op-ed, a video op-ed, tore into John Oliver's recent monologue. Let's take a look together.
Israeli civilians were killed this week, which is terrible. But the point is, this isn't tit for tat.
Yeah, that's the point. The terminology and the symmetry. Israelis don't die enough. We'll keep trying. How many Israeli casualties will satisfy you? A child, do you count it as less than one? It's a war. And as the great Churchill once said, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and symmetry.
Eve, does humor work?
I'm not sure it works. I think what is required is a mass dissemination of historical fact, of education, of empowering our own people with the arguments and the language to use to try and debunk these myths. Of course, for people who are aggrieved by the extensive amount of lies that exist online, there is some comfort in the humor of these kind of clapback videos. But I think what we're really dealing with here is a need to deal head on with celebrities such as Bella and Gigi Hadid, who have enormous audiences and who are posting Instagram live feeds from protests around the world where people are screaming from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and they have no idea the genocidal messaging behind language like that. They don't know what it means, and we need to do better at disseminating the truth and educating people on what these rallying cries actually stand for.
It all starts and ends with education. Yigal, before we part, what can we learn? What can Israel do better?
First of all, if you want your communications to improve, you need your politics to deliver a message that is acceptable and palatable to the audiences that you are trying to convince. It all starts with action. Communication does not replace action. It accompanies action, political action in this case. So first and foremost, I would say you have to act, the government of Israel, has to act politically in a way that can be easily communicated in terms that are acceptable and convincing to the audiences that we are seeking to convince. We should not place communications as an independent and disconnected discipline, which will do what it has to do, while politicians act just any old way they want. That doesn't work, and that is a recipe for failure, time and again.
Okay. Yigal Palmor and Eve Barlow, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us for this